History remembers men by where they ended up, not by where they were sent. Rome remembers Peter. Spain remembers James. Greece remembers Andrew. India remembers Thomas quietly, not because he conquered it, not because he ruled it, but because he died there far from applause, far from witnesses who would preserve his memory in ink and empire. Thomas did not go west. He went east, where history thins out, where records dissolve into silence, and where faith survives mostly through memory, not monuments. This is where his story becomes difficult to reconstruct. And that difficulty matters, because St. Thomas does not come to us wrapped in polished narrative. He comes fractured, partly biblical, partly traditional, partly preserved by communities that never held political power. And that alone should already tell us something about the nature of his witness. The Gospels do not give us a flattering portrait of Thomas. They give us an honest one. He is not impulsive like Peter, not eloquent like John, not politically charged like Simon the Zealot. Thomas appears rarely, and when he does, it is usually when something is uncertain. When Jesus speaks of returning to Judea, a place already hostile, it is Thomas who says, quietly, almost grimly, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This is not bravado. This is resignation mixed with loyalty. Thomas does not deny danger. He accepts it, and then comes the moment that history refuses to let him forget. The resurrection. While the others celebrate, Thomas is absent. We are not told why. The text does not explain. It simply states the absence, and absence matters in Scripture. When he returns, the others tell him what they have seen, and Thomas responds with words that have followed him for centuries. "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." This is not arrogance. It is precision. Thomas does not say, "I doubt." He says, "I need to know." And when Christ appears again, he does not rebuke him. He invites him, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answers with the most direct confession in the Gospels. "My Lord and my God." Not a parable, not a metaphor, a declaration. And from that moment onward, Thomas disappears from the Gospel narrative, not because his faith diminished, but because his path diverged. The book of Acts does not track all the apostles equally. Some are followed closely, others fade. This is not neglect. It is theology. Scripture highlights movements that shaped the Roman world, because Rome would later shape Scripture's preservation. Thomas's mission did not move toward Rome. It moved away from it. Early Christian tradition holds that after Pentecost, the apostles dispersed, not randomly, but deliberately. The known world was divided, and each man went where no other wanted to go. Thomas went east, not to friendly synagogues, not to cities already steeped in Jewish expectation, but beyond the familiar map, Parthia, Persia, and further still, toward India. To understand the weight of Thomas's mission, we must understand the world he entered. First century India was not primitive. It was ancient, complex, and religiously saturated. This was a land of temples older than Rome itself, philosophies older than Greek thought, social structures so deeply rooted that faith and identity were inseparable. Religion was not a private matter. It was the architecture of society. Caste dictated worth. Ritual dictated belonging. Birth dictated destiny. And Thomas arrived with a message that quietly dismantled all of it. A God who became flesh. A kingdom not inherited by blood. A salvation not earned by ritual. A Lord who washed feet. This was not merely foreign. It was disruptive. Early Indian Christian tradition places Thomas's arrival on the Malabar coast, modern-day Kerala, around AD 52. This is not a legend built centuries later without grounding. It is supported by continuous community memory, the kind that survives not because it is written, but because it is lived. These communities did not gain power from this story. They gained persecution, which makes fabrication unlikely. According to tradition, Thomas did not arrive as a conqueror. He arrived as a stranger, possibly as a carpenter, possibly as a laborer, not announcing himself, not drawing crowds, that detail matters. Thomas did not evangelize loudly. He evangelized relationally, and that made him dangerous. There are no letters from Thomas preserved in the canon, no epistles bearing his name. This absence is often misunderstood as insignificance. In reality, it reflects geography. Texts survived where institutions survived. Institutions survived where Christianity aligned, eventually with power. India offered neither. Thomas built communities without protection, faith without infrastructure, belief without political leverage. This is not the Christianity of councils and creeds. This is the Christianity of risk. There is a reason most missionaries went west. The East demanded adaptation without compromise, language without translation shortcuts, cultural immersion without dominance. Thomas did not impose Jewish custom. He preached Christ. That distinction mattered, but it also isolated him. There were no fellow apostles nearby, no reinforcement, no safety net, and isolation does something to faith. It strips it of performance. Not all opposition arrives immediately. Sometimes it watches. Thomas's early success, quiet conversions, small communities, did not provoke immediate violence, but it provoked concern. Conversion in India was not individual. It disrupted family lineage, economic systems, religious hierarchies. A man who convinced people that identity could be reborn was a threat, even without a sword. By now, Thomas was no longer young. He carried scars, not just physical but emotional. He had outlived Judas. He had watched James fall. He had lived long enough to know that following Christ did not end in safety. And yet he stayed, not because India embraced him, but because Christ sent him. This is where modern faith often disconnects. We speak of calling as fulfillment. Scripture presents it as obedience. Thomas did not go east because it aligned with his gifts. He went because he was assigned. And obedience, when stripped of affirmation, becomes lonely. No letters preserved, no accolades, no applause, just consistency. Before martyrdom comes obscurity. Before death comes endurance. Before legacy comes silence. St. Thomas did not die famous. He died faithful. And that distinction will matter when the spear is raised. By the time resistance became visible, it had already been forming for years. Faith rarely announces itself as a threat. It becomes one slowly, quietly, as it reshapes how people think, live, and belong. Thomas did not arrive in India as a revolutionary. He became one by staying. The earliest communities associated with Thomas did not look like churches as later centuries would define them. They were households, families, small gatherings bound not by ritual obligation, but by shared belief. This made them difficult to detect and impossible to control. There was no central temple to destroy, no single leader to imprison and dismantle the movement. But there was Thomas, and that mattered, because movements survive ideas. They fracture without witnesses. In first-century India, belief was not abstract. It governed marriage, occupation, inheritance, social standing. To adopt a new faith was not merely to change one's theology. It was to threaten the coherence of the social order. When Thomas preached that salvation was not inherited through birth, he challenged caste. When he preached to God, who entered human suffering, he challenged philosophical distance. When he preached a kingdom not tied to geography or bloodline, he undermined both temple authority and royal legitimacy. And he did it without raising his voice. Tradition records that Thomas interacted with local kings and elites, not as an advisor, but as a craftsman. This detail is consistent across multiple strands of early Eastern Christian memory. He did not stand above power. He stood beneath it. And that made his influence unsettling. A man who serves quietly, yet speaks with conviction, is difficult to dismiss. Thomas was not perceived as dangerous because he sought influence. He was dangerous because influence found him. Thomas did not compel conversion. There were no mass baptisms by decree, no political alignment. What spread was testimony, stories of healing, stories of compassion, stories of a God who did not remain distant. And slowly, Belief crossed boundaries it was not supposed to cross. Temples in India were not merely religious centers. They were economic engines, cultural anchors, symbols of continuity. Any belief system that redirected loyalty away from the temple threatened more than worship. It threatened stability. Christianity, as Thomas presented it, did not demand the destruction of temples, but it demanded exclusive allegiance. And exclusivity is intolerable to systems built on layered devotion. Opposition did not erupt immediately. It accumulated. Local religious authorities noticed shifts in behavior, rituals abandoned, social boundaries crossed, allegiances redirected. These changes did not announce themselves as rebellion. They appeared as disobedience. And disobedience, even when peaceful, is never ignored for long. What is striking in the tradition surrounding Thomas is not his charisma, it is his consistency. He did not adapt the core of his message to gain acceptance. He adapted his manner, not his truth. This is where pressure began to focus. A faith that can be absorbed is tolerated. A faith that resists absorption is resisted. As resistance grew, Thomas's position became more precarious. He was a foreigner. He had no tribe, no inherited protection. The communities he nurtured could disperse. He could not. This is the burden of leadership in hostile environments. The shepherd remains visible when the flock hides. The first accusations were not violent. They were ideological. Thomas was accused of corrupting tradition, undermining social harmony, introducing foreign instability. These accusations are consistent across cultures and centuries. They are always leveled against beliefs that cannot be easily controlled. Tolerance has boundaries. When belief remains private, it is ignored. When it becomes communal, it is monitored. When it reshapes identity, it is confronted. Thomas crossed the final threshold, not by intention, but by effect. Thomas could have left. He had traveled before. He knew survival strategies, but departure would have confirmed suspicion that his message was temporary. Staying affirmed something more dangerous: conviction. There is no record of Thomas claiming victory, no celebration of numerical growth. His ministry was not measured in scale, but in endurance. This is uncomfortable for modern faith. We associate divine approval with expansion. Thomas associated it with faithfulness. By now, Thomas was no longer merely tolerated. He was watched, and surveillance always precedes confrontation. Religious authorities do not fear disagreement. They fear loyalty, and Thomas commanded it quietly. He did not become Indian in appearance. He did not fully belong, and yet he did not retreat into isolation. He remained present. This tension between presence and belonging is where martyrdom begins long before death. Martyrdom does not begin with violence. It begins with refusal to leave. Thomas became a martyr in waiting the moment he chose presence over safety. The structures that tolerated him were reaching their limits, and the silence that had followed him from Jerusalem was about to be broken. There is a moment in every persecution when tolerance ends, not with noise, not with warning, but with decision. For years, Thomas had existed within a fragile margin, allowed, watched, quietly resisted. He had learned the rhythms of that margin, how far he could move without provoking force, how much he could say without inciting immediate reaction. But margins are not permanent. They are temporary agreements, and those agreements always expire. The turning point was not theological debate. It was classification. Thomas's faith was no longer seen as a personal conviction. It was now identified as a social disruption. This reclassification matters. Once belief is framed as threat, action becomes justified, not in the eyes of the persecuted, but in the conscience of the persecutor. From this point forward, Thomas was no longer tolerated as a foreign teacher. He was regarded as a destabilizing presence. Historical tradition does not preserve a formal trial transcript, but it preserves the logic of accusation. Thomas was accused of corrupting the people not morally, but structurally. He taught loyalty beyond kinship. He taught identity beyond birth. He taught a kingdom beyond geography. These ideas eroded the certainty on which authority rested. And authority does not need truth to act. It needs justification. Thomas's arrest, according to early tradition, was not public. This detail is consistent with how disruptive figures are often removed. Public spectacles create sympathy. Quiet removals create compliance. There are no riots recorded, no mass protest. The communities he nurtured were small and cautious. They had learned survival. Thomas had learned surrender. Once detained, Thomas was separated. Isolation is the first true weapon of persecution. It removes reinforcement. It erodes certainty. It creates space for doubt. But Thomas had lived with isolation for years. He had crossed oceans alone, preached without peers, built faith without recognition. Isolation was not new. Silence was familiar. There is no preserved speech from Thomas in his final days. This absence is telling. Either his words were not recorded, or they were not permitted. Martyrs do not always get a platform. Sometimes the refusal to amplify is the point. What survives instead is the posture. Tradition consistently presents Thomas not as defiant, but composed. There is no record of him resisting arrest, no appeal to authority, no negotiation. This is not resignation. It is recognition. Thomas understood the pattern. He had seen it before. He had watched Christ walk it. Early Christian tradition places Thomas's death near Mylapore, close to present-day Chennai, not in a palace, not in a public square, near a hill, a place associated with prayer. This detail aligns across independent traditions. Martyrdom did not interrupt his faith. It concluded it. The method of execution matters. Thomas was killed by a spear, not by crucifixion, not by burning, not by prolonged torture. A spear is efficient, decisive, final. It is the weapon of authority, not rage. This was not an emotional execution. It was a corrective one. There is no dramatic monologue preserved, no final sermon, no recorded cry. What tradition emphasizes instead is posture. Thomas was praying. This matters. He did not die arguing. He did not die pleading. He died oriented toward God. There were no witnesses tasked with preserving the moment, no Roman historians, no imperial record. His death did not interrupt trade routes. It did not provoke policy change. And that is precisely why it is so easy to overlook. Martyrdom does not require recognition to be complete. The spear ended Thomas's life, but it did not dismantle what he had established. The communities did not vanish. They withdrew. Silence returned, and silence preserved them. Thomas's death did not look victorious. There was no immediate expansion, no visible triumph. From a worldly perspective, the mission appeared incomplete. But Christianity does not measure success the way empires do. Modern faith often romanticizes martyrdom. Ancient martyrdom was not romantic. It was lonely, uncelebrated, final. Thomas did not die, surrounded by crowds shouting his name. He died as he lived in India, largely unseen. His death did not erase his influence. It sealed it, because faith rooted in blood does not require the living voice of its founder. It requires memory, and memory is more durable than monuments. Martyrdom is not defined by cruelty. It is defined by faithfulness when continuation is no longer an option. Thomas did not choose death. He refused to abandon truth to avoid it, and that refusal was enough. Martyrdom does not end with death. It ends with memory, and memory is shaped not only by what is recorded, but by what survives without record. Thomas left no letters behind him in India, no official institution bearing his name, no empire to protect his story. What he left instead was something far more fragile and far more resilient. He left believers. Tradition holds that Thomas was buried near the place of his death, in the region of Mylapore. There was no state funeral, no marker erected by authority, no declaration to preserve his significance. His burial was quiet. This was not negligence. It was necessity. Public reverence would have invited further violence. Silence protected the living. The first Indian Christians learned early what survival required. After Thomas's death, the communities he had nurtured did not collapse. They adapted. Faith in India learned concealment long before it learned expansion. Worship moved into homes. Teaching passed through families. Memory became the primary archive. This is how belief survives when it cannot announce itself. What makes Thomas's legacy remarkable is not documentation. It is continuity. For centuries, Indian Christian communities identified themselves not through Rome or Constantinople, but through Thomas. They did not claim dominance. They claimed origin. They called themselves St. Thomas Christians, not as an honorific, but as a lineage. This was not about authority. It was about witness. Indian Christianity did not develop with the reinforcement of councils, creeds, or imperial favor. It developed in parallel, often ignored by the West, sometimes doubted by it. But faith does not require validation to exist. Thomas's legacy exposes a difficult truth. Christianity does not depend on visibility. It depends on endurance. Modern faith often equates silence with failure. But silence is not absence. It is restraint. Thomas's silence, both in life and in death, preserved his work from distortion. There was no platform to corrupt his message, no institution to weaponize it, only memory. Thomas's death does not offer dramatic imagery. There is no arena, no crowd, no prolonged suffering recorded for emphasis. And yet, this restraint is precisely what gives his martyrdom weight. He was not killed to entertain power. He was killed to remove disruption. That is the most honest form of martyrdom. His death did not end persecution. It did not usher in peace. It did not immediately expand the church. What it did was confirm sincerity. Only belief survives when its founder does not. Thomas does not leave us with a method. He leaves us with a question. What kind of faith survives without reward, without recognition, without protection, without certainty of success? We live in an age that broadcasts belief. Thomas lived in one that buried it. And yet, his faith outlasted empires that never heard his name. This should unsettle us, because it suggests that visibility is not the measure of truth. Christianity did not begin in the West. It moved east first. Thomas carried it there without knowing if it would survive him. That ignorance did not weaken his obedience. It defined it. Martyrdom costs more than life. It costs legacy control. Thomas did not get to shape how history would remember him. He trusted God with that too. Thomas is remembered not for miracles recorded, not for writings preserved, but for faith sustained in silence. He believed without seeing, long before others praised him for it. And when the spear ended his life, it did not end his witness. It sealed it. St. Thomas did not conquer India. He trusted God with it. And that trust, quiet, uncompensated, and uncelebrated it, is why his name still survives where louder faiths disappeared.